This is Research Like a Pro, episode 272, Proving an Ancestor with DNA, Benjamin Cox. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Today's episode is brought to you by findagrave.com, the best place to search online for burial information for your family, friends, and famous people. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Research Like a Pro today. How are you, Diana?
I am doing well. How are you, Nicole?
Fantastic. What have you been working on or reading?
Well, our study group is in full swing, and I'm working on the timeline for Clemsy Cline. I did a project on her a year ago, and then I did a little mini follow-up project for our 14-day challenge in January of this year and ordered some land patent applications from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but I didn't have the time to fully go through those, make the citations, put them into my timeline. So I am revisiting that, working on getting those all put into my timeline for the 3 individuals that I think are her family members. Not sure yet. This is such a severely burned county. They're in Izard County and all the counties around Izard. So it's really tricky finding records and making connections, which is why I'm doing this project. So it's been fun revisiting this research and actually getting those land patents into my timeline.
Cool. Yeah, land patents are a fun source.
You're always hoping that you're going to get in the application some little clue. And so far, they look like they're just pretty straightforward. John C. Klein applied for the land on this day. He paid this much money, and here's the certificate. But that's okay. It's one of those avenues you just continue following up on. And they actually have tract book entries. So, in the tract books that they create. And my next step will probably be to go look those up and see if there are any other clues there. So one thing leads to another.
Right. Yeah, we always hope there will be some great clue, but it's just part of reasonably exhaustive research to chase down all these leads. And then, if there's nothing there, at least we checked.
Exactly. And you just move on. Well, let's do some announcements. We have our Airtable Quick Reference Guide available on the website for a PDF download. And we have our Research Like a Pro webinar series for 2023 going. And this has been so fun. We have enjoyed these. All the recordings are there if you're interested in joining up and just watching all the past case studies, really showing how people use the Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro DNA process to make progress on their projects. Our next study group will be in the spring, and this will be a DNA study group. So if you're interested, you can take a look at our website. And if you're interested in being a peer group leader, the application is on our website. That's a really great opportunity to be able to meet with a small group weekly and really dig into your projects together. And as always, join our newsletter for any coupons for sales as they come up.
Today, we get to talk about proving an ancestor with DNA. And I know this is a topic a lot of you will be very interested in. We'll use as an example the case study of Benjamin Cox, who's one of our ancestors that my mom, Diana, has researched a lot. So, do you also have an individual that you have researched a lot of times and maybe you've found a lot of indirect evidence pointing to him or her as your ancestor, but maybe you're still unsure and you're not quite certain of the next steps to really prove that connection? Well, DNA evidence is a fantastic tool to help you prove those biological relationships that you have inferred, you've suspected, but you haven't really feel were final. And so we can use this tool to help give weight and evidence to our conclusions. A lot of the time, the DNA evidence will support our conclusion, and that can really help us feel more confident with it. So, a while ago, Diana hypothesized Benjamin Cox as the father of her third great grandmother, Rachel Cox. That would be my fourth great grandmother. And records in Texas in 1850 are not very plentiful. And although the migration pattern seemed correct leading to Texas and kind of matching up with the relatives in the fan club, it just wasn't certain. And some of the other Cox researchers did not have Rachel as a daughter of Benjamin Cox in their family trees, and they didn't believe she was Benjamin's daughter. So there was doubt cast onto this hypothesis.
Right. It's always kind of disappointing when you email someone, you say, "Hey, I think my person is in the family," and they email back and say, "No, she's not in our family tree. She was probably just a niece. They would just travel all over the place." And I thought, that doesn't make sense to me. Everything seems like she should be in the family. So we had done DNA and had seen that we actually matched up on a little segment, but this was many, many years ago. And there just was not a big enough database on Ancestry DNA to really work with the DNA. So when I returned to this in 2019, there was much more evidence to use for DNA, with a lot more people having tested and a lot more people in the database. So when I started using the Research Like a Pro with DNA Process to work on this case, I ended up doing two projects on Benjamin and Rachel Cox, hoping either to disprove or to prove the relationship. And, sometimes we don't want to think about disproving, but that can be just as helpful, because then you move on. So I did complete projects with the study group and ended up with two complete reports. And it was really good for me to do a complete project, because it made me go back to the records and write up my conclusions so I could see clearly, what was I thinking? Why did I have this little thought that Rachel should be in this family? So I went ahead and attached Benjamin Cox as her father in my ancestry tree so that I would get through lines. And then I started messaging those, and I immediately got a response. It's always so exciting when you find someone else who is into DNA and genealogy. And I got a response from this woman, and she turned out to be a descendant of Benjamin's only son. And she had a similar case where this son was not mentioned in the records, and she just felt like he had to be Benjamin Cox's son. And so we shared DNA information, and it looked like this was really plausible that her ancestor and mine were brother and sister and both came from Benjamin. But then I decided I needed to have more evidence, and I needed to do more documentary research for Benjamin in his pre Texas years. I had traced him pretty well in Texas and even a bit in Arkansas. But then he had this migration path from Ohio and Indiana that I really knew nothing about. A few people online had some trees with some records, but I hadn't personally really tracked that. And so I decided that needed to be a project. And I also needed more DNA evidence. So I recruited 4 additional test takers who were all either descendants of Rachel Cox, or one of them was a descendant of one of the pretty much known children of Benjamin. And they let me use their DNA. They just shared their results with me at Ancestry, and then I could see their matches. And the really great thing was that 2 of them were a generation closer to Benjamin Cox, and they had so many more matches and better matches. They shared much more DNA with those matches than I did, because I was just sharing small pieces. I was doing like 10 to 15 centimorgans, and they had 30 and 40. So we were getting much better DNA evidence from them.
That's always so exciting when you can see your evidence piling up especially when you get those test takers who are closer generationally.
Yes.
Okay, well, next I'm going to read the conclusion of the second report that Diana wrote, and this will be helpful to kind of see what she learned, and also it can give you an example of how a conclusion might sound of a research report if you haven't ever written one before. And one of the important parts of writing a conclusion of a research report is to kind of reiterate the main conclusions, the things that you found, and then whether or not you felt you met the research objective. And if you didn't meet the research objective, the next section will say the research that you need to continue doing. Okay, let's read this. This research project was very successful in identifying more information about Benjamin Cox in early Indiana records. Records for each of his proposed children pointed to a birth of between 1813 and 1829 in Ohio or Indiana. Tracing Ohio tax and marriage records, then Indiana census and land records, a likely candidate for the Benjamin Cox of this record was identified. Benjamin first appeared in Ross County, Ohio tax records of 1810. He married Keziah Barbie in 1813 in Ross County and continued to be listed in the tax records there until 1819. By 1820, he had moved his household west to the Flat Rock Township in the Delaware, Indiana cession. Flat Rock became part of Bartholomew County in 1821, and Benjamin probably received a land patent for neighboring Jackson County in 1827. By 1830, he was residing in Monroe County, Indiana. Benjamin's oldest daughters, Amy and Lavina, married in 1834 in Bartholomew County, Indiana. Amy never left Indiana, but the remainder of Benjamin's proposed children migrated to Arkansas, then to Texas. The pre 1850 census records for the household of Benjamin Cox have appropriate places for the proposed children, and by 1860, nearly all the married couples are residing in Bell County, Texas. The exceptions are Amy, who remained in Indiana, and Rachel, whose location in 1860 is unknown. The DNA evidence showed multiple shared matches between Benjamin Cox descendants: Diana Elder, Lucretia Becker Neal, Patricia Hoskins, and Darrell Stevens. Between the four descendants, matches were shown to other Cox descendants through all of the proposed Cox children. Combined with traditional research, which shows a similar migration from Indiana, Arkansas to Texas, the DNA evidence proves conclusively that Benjamin Cox was the father of Rachel Cox.
It's fun to read through that conclusion again and remember all the research that led to that. And, as you listen to that, so if you were listening, probably realize that I had to do a lot of research. I had to go through each of those children. And of course, he had a lot of children. We're not just talking two or three. I think he ended up with 8 or 9 and tracing all of them, which was fun. It was great to see that evidence adding up. Well, I needed to have a method to track that DNA that was shared between each of those test takers. So I had to look at my DNA and find all of my matches. And then I had to look at Lucretia and find all of her matches. And so I tried my hand at creating a McGuire chart. And this is just a chart that shows the genetic network between multiple descendants of Benjamin Cox. So I listed my 5 test takers whose DNA I had access to on the far left of the chart. You can picture, a lucid chart diagram. And I gave each person a different color. And then I put the DNA matches coming straight down from the child that they descended from. And then I did a little circle under each of the descendants that we matched and put how much each person shared. And so, it was kind of a labor intensive project. Would I do it again like that? I don't know. Maybe it was fun to do the chart. And I really did see that the evidence just added up. So, there are 6 known children. So the 6 known children of Benjamin Cox I put across the top, and I did them in chronological order by birth. And then I have all of their descendancy coming down. And some of them had more DNA matches than others just because perhaps they had more children or more people in that family had taken a DNA test. But of my 5 test takers, there was not one DNA match that everybody matched. There was not one descendant that all 5 of us matched. There was a descendant that 4 of us matched, or that 2 of us matched, or that just one of us matched. So it was really interesting to see this randomness of DNA inheritance coming down and seeing how each of us that I had access to DNA results for matched a little differently with all these different descendants.
And that's why it's so important to have multiple test takers whose results you can analyze, because then you can find more evidence instead of kind of that spotty evidence where you were just looking at your own test. You only matched a few of the descendants of Benjamin and it was small amounts. But then, at the body of evidence, when you had 3 or 4 test takers to compare, so many more matches, it just really helps you build up a case.
Absolutely. And it was really great to confirm what my hypothesis was through the DNA.
Yeah, it really helps you feel like I did a good job with my documentary
Mhm.
research.
I drew the right conclusions all the way along there.
That's great. Well, let's talk more about who was Benjamin Cox. Well, he was likely born in Ohio about 1791, perhaps in Ross County, since he first appeared in the tax records there in 1810. He was at that time residing in Jefferson Township, and he had purchased land from John Groves. And his land was not on a water course, but he was near a tributary of the Scioto River. And on the map, you can see this map if you go to the corresponding blog post. And there's a blue pin on the map that shows the land for the description of Range 20, Township 8, Section 35 Southwest in Ross County. And Benjamin married Keziah Barbie on May 7th, 1813, almost 1 year after his probable sister, Rachel Cox, married Harley Barbie on 4 June 1812. This is interesting because it looks kind of like the case of siblings marrying siblings, right? And so this is very likely, but it needs a little more research to verify. But the name Rachel caught Diana's attention because our ancestor is also named Rachel. So it seems possible that Benjamin could have named his daughter after this probable sister, which is a great clue for naming patterns. And it really adds to your body of evidence when you can see that. Well, Benjamin and Keziah had a large family, almost entirely of daughters. Connecting Rachel to Benjamin involved tracing each of these siblings and noting their similar migrations from Ohio or Indiana to Texas. And it's just interesting that all of these proposed children to Benjamin, except for Amy the first, they all moved south to Arkansas and then continued moving on to Texas.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. Just that lure of land, perhaps in Texas, always the land. Well, let's just look briefly at each of those children. So there was Amy, and she's the one that stays in Indiana. She was born about 1814 in Ross County and died in 1907 in Jackson County, Indiana. She just stayed put. And she had married in Bartholomew County, Indiana in 1834. And it was really great because there was actually a marriage record for Amy. And so, sometimes when we have a lot of record loss, it's nice to get those specific records that put people in that place. Well, the next sister was Lavina Cox, and she was born about 1814. So they're both born about 1814. It was one of those cases we don't know specifically, but they were pretty close in age. And she died after her 1860 census enumeration in Bell County, Texas. So we don't have specific information about her. She just shows up on the 1860 census in Texas and then she's gone. But we do have her marriage record there in Bartholomew County again. And she married the same year as her sister, 1834, just 6 weeks after her sister. And she married first a Crouch, John Crouch, and then she secondly married Lawson Smith. Well, next we have Sarah Cox, who married a Stevens, and she was born a little bit later, between 1860 and 1820, in either Ohio or Indiana, depending on which census you're looking at. So you can see that they knew there was some Ohio background, but then also some Indiana. Whoever was the informant knew of that migration. And she again died after her 1880 enumeration, and we don't have a specific death for her. And she died actually in Arkansas, so she didn't quite make it over to Texas. And then we have Minerva, who was born on April 11th, 1821 in Indiana and died on 11 September 1902 in Falls County, Texas. So we have death information and birth information for her from the records that were created at her death. And then we have the only boy, William Thomas Cox, and he was born in 1827 in Indiana and died in 1912 in Limestone County, Texas. Married Elizabeth in 1848 and Sarah in 1865. And then we have Rachel, our ancestor, and she looks to be the baby of the family, born in 1829 in Indiana and died between 1870 and 1880 in Falls County. So again, don't have a death date for her. So many of these people just died in Texas and we haven't found headstones or they didn't last if they did erect a headstone and it was too early for death certificates and they didn't record them in the counties. So we don't really know. But she had married Hickman Monroe Schultz in 1850 on July 4th in Navarro County, Texas. So that's really how I knew her maiden name was Cox, because I have a marriage record that says Rachel Cox. So, there's a rundown of the family, and you can see why when I kept seeing she was born in 1829 in Indiana, I thought, well, she fits into this family that has Indiana roots, and the dates really seem to match up. All right, well, let's take a minute and hear a word from our sponsor, Find a Grave. Find a Grave is the ultimate online destination to discover burial information and cemetery details for family, friends, and famous people. Finding the graves of your ancestors has never been easier. You can create virtual memorials, add photos of headstones, and honor your loved ones with virtual flowers. Find a Grave's user-friendly search features allow you to explore by name, location, cemetery, date, and more. Their dedicated community of members continually adds new information, so it's worth searching again if you haven't found what you were looking for. Want to be part of the Find a Grave community? Download the free app, visit your local cemetery, and contribute missing grave information. It's a rewarding way to spend time outdoors while helping others find the burial locations of their loved ones.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Benjamin Cox's migration. We've alluded to the fact that he migrated all over the place, and that makes it pretty tricky, especially when there's a common name like Benjamin Cox. His presence in Ohio seemed fairly certain because of the tax and the marriage records. But what about his move to Indiana? That was important to the hypothesis since Rachel Cox was born about 1829 in Indiana. So we needed to be able to place Benjamin there in 1829 with historical records. So the 1820 census listed 10 men named Benjamin Cox who resided in either Ohio or Indiana. Can you believe that? 10 men. Studying the tax records of Ross County, Ohio, found that Benjamin consistently paid taxes for the Jefferson Township land until 1819, which is the last time he's listed there. So we reasoned that Benjamin moved to Indiana by 1820 and then researched each of the 1820 listings to prove or disprove them. The best case for our Benjamin Cox was the 1820 enumeration of Flat Rock Township in the newly formed Delaware County, Indiana. Adding to evidence that this was the correct Benjamin was the presence of Daniel and Olaf Barbie, likely family members of Benjamin's wife, Keziah Barbie. And I love that because it just shows how important and helpful the fan club can be when you have men of the same name. And with a surname like Barbie, Barbee, that's relatively uncommon compared to Cox, that can really help you figure out which is your right person. A land patent in Jackson County and then marriage records for Benjamin's two oldest daughters in Bartholomew County and then the 1830 census of Monroe County, Indiana, all showed Benjamin and his family residing in the same general vicinity. And in the blog post, you can look at the map and see stars on these three locations in Indiana. So this was helpful because it helped us confirm that Rachel Cox, who was born in 1829 in Indiana, could fit into the family and that Benjamin lived there in Indiana. And so the makeup of the 1830 census does show a female under 5, and that could have been Rachel. Sometime after Rachel's birth, her mother, Keziah, died, and Benjamin moved the family south to Arkansas, where he married again to the widow Elizabeth Donahoe Sutton. That blended family resulted in a large household of 18 individuals, ranging from young children to a male between 70 to 79, possibly a father of either Benjamin or Elizabeth. And this was the household in 1840, I believe. Again, Rachel fit into this family as one of the three females ages 10 to 14. But I'm imagining that having this huge blended family made it a little bit trickier to sort out who everyone was in that enumeration.
Yeah, it did. And it turned out that that was what was causing some of the trouble with the other researcher because of that census and attributing the wrong people as children of Benjamin Cox. So let's talk about Texas. Benjamin moved his household yet again, this time to Navarro County, Texas, between 1843, when he was last taxed in Izard County, and 1848, when he shows up as a road commissioner in Navarro County, Texas. So that was a key record in connecting them because Rachel had married Hickman Monroe Schultz on July 4th, 1848, in Navarro County. And guess what? Monroe Schultz and Benjamin Cox were road commissioners in the same road. And so I knew that they were there in the same area in Texas, which is why I had really pinpointed him as a connection. Now, by the 1850 census enumeration, Benjamin had actually moved from Navarro County, so he just didn't stay put, over to Travis County, and that was the first census to name all the household members. And that does show the blended Cox Sutton household, as well as two daughters of Benjamin and Elizabeth, his second wife. So one of the Cox females, she was named Hannah Cox, and she was age 19, and she was the daughter that other researchers had in place of Rachel in the family trees. Rachel was 20 at the time. But DNA analysis proved that wrong. Hannah was a Sutton and a daughter of Elizabeth, but not Benjamin. And so she had just been named a Cox, which threw everyone off. And we see that all the time in the 1850 census. We've had other ancestors where they just list all the children by the second husband's name, even though he's not a biological father. Benjamin moved again to Bell County, Texas, and that's where he lived out his life. He even served as a Texas Ranger in his 60s. And A History of Bell County talks about Lieutenant Benjamin Cox as part of the Independent Blues, organized to pursue Indians who made a raid down Nolan Creek and stole many horses from the Coxes and Suttons, the heaviest losers. So, like so many of these early Texans, no evidence has come to light with a specific date for him. And the last residence we have was 1870. He was still living with Elizabeth, and he was noted as a woodworkman for his occupation. And at age 79 for that census, he probably died soon after, as the 1880 census does not show him at all. So tracing his life just provided such a great timeline of his migration and a place for Rachel in the family. And then DNA provided the needed proof of where she fit in.
Wow, that's just wonderful to be able to come to that conclusion. And the part about Hannah was so interesting. The fact that Hannah was listed as a Cox with her stepfather's surname in 1850 had thrown researchers for a loop. And it just really points to the importance of reasonably exhaustive research, and not just for your person, but for everyone in their family. And if you don't do that, you risk coming to incorrect conclusions, like putting Hannah Cox as one of Benjamin's daughters.
Right. And the DNA evidence showed that none of my test takers had any type of connection to Hannah Cox whatsoever. So it was obvious that she was not biologically a Cox.
Right. Did you do additional documentary research on her to trace her forward or backward?
I had already done some research on her, and I saw that she actually ends up moving near Rachel Cox. She married a Wood was the surname of the individual, and I think that even though they would have been stepsisters, because they were similar in age, I think that they kept more together than maybe some of the other siblings. So that was kind of fun, and I haven't traced her much more than that, but I did, did the basic tracing to see where she went and what happened to her.
What an interesting instance of using negative DNA evidence. If you didn't have matches to descendants of Hannah just by yourself, that wouldn't be very strong. But when you have four descendants of Benjamin Cox and none of them are matching any descendants of Hannah Cox, it's a bit stronger. Of course, there's always the chance that she didn't have any descendants who've DNA tested. So, it's possible they're just not showing up. But I like this negative evidence that you have so far. It's great.
Yeah, it's fun. This was a fun project. One of my favorites because I actually was able to come to a good conclusion.
Yeah, and I love the idea that they were the same age, Hannah and Rachel, and that they were friends and that, they continued to stay in touch and were neighbors. So it's kind of fun to think about that.
It is, and especially in a really large family like this. Going back to that timeline of the children, Rachel was quite a bit younger. than her other siblings. The oldest one, Amy, was born about 1814, and Rachel wasn't born until 1829. So a 15-year span thereabout. So she would have probably connected much more with Hannah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And it's so fun to talk about one of our ancestors that we've been able to find a lot of DNA evidence that confirms the hypothesis. So it's fun to have been able to add Benjamin Cox to our family tree.
Well, great.
All right, well, if you're interested in learning more about the process Diana used in doing this research, check out her webinar on this case study in our Research Like a Pro webinar 2023 series. In January, she talked about this case study, and you can also read the 2 reports that she wrote about Benjamin Cox, and those are posted in the show notes for this episode and the blog post that goes along with it. All right, thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.